Well, hey there, everybody. It's Christmas Eve 2024, and welcome to another deep dive. Tonight we're going to be tackling a pretty huge question,
Huge is an understatement, I think.
and that question is this. Does God exist?
Now, I know, everybody's probably got an opinion on that. But we're not here to tell you what to believe.
Definitely not. Tonight we're going to be exploring the arguments both for and against using two main sources.
We've got excerpts from this article called Does God Really Exist? It's from Focus on the Family.
Okay, so that's one. And for a different perspective, we've also got the Wikipedia article on the existence of God.
So yeah, kind of two different starting points there.
Absolutely. And look, before we dive in, we just want to say that we know this can be a really sensitive topic.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
just a reminder, we're not taking sides here.
Just exploring.
We're just going to lay out the arguments, the different perspectives, and let you, the listener, come to your own conclusions.
All right. Sounds good to me.
Cool. So I guess, even before we get into the actual arguments, maybe it's worth kind of defining some terms here.
Oh, absolutely.
What are the different positions people take when it comes to the question of God's existence?
Right. It's not always just a simple yes or no.
Right. Most people know the basics.
Yeah.
You've got theism, atheism, but what about everything in between?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
like I said, you've got your theists.
Theist believing in a God, some kind of God, or gods even.
A god or gods, yep. And then you've got your atheists who don't believe in any god.
Okay. Pretty straightforward so far.
Yeah.
So where do ideas like agnosticism fit in? Because, it's about if we can really know whether God exists or not.
Right. That's the key for agnosticism. It basically says, look, we just can't know for sure.
Mm.
It acknowledges that there are limits to what we can prove or disprove, especially when it comes to these really big kind of ultimate questions.
So it's not about saying God definitely does exist or God definitely doesn't exist. It's more like saying we just can't know.
Exactly. And then to make things even more complex, you have things like agnosticism, which goes a step further.
Agnosticism. Okay. I'm not super familiar with that one.
Well, it kind of focuses on the problem of even defining God in the first place. How can you talk about whether something exists if you can't even agree on what that something is?
That's a good point. It's before we even ask if God exists, we need to be on the same page about what God even means.
Precisely. And that just highlights how tricky this whole topic is, you know?
It's definitely more nuanced than I think a lot of people realize.
Definitely. Now, one helpful way to kind of visualize this whole range of beliefs is through something called the spectrum of theistic probability.
Okay.
It was proposed by Richard Dawkins, who's this evolutionary biologist and, a pretty prominent atheist.
Oh, yeah, Richard Dawkins. I know his work.
Yeah. So this spectrum, it's like a scale.
Okay.
And it's got these 7, what he calls milestones of belief. It starts with strong theists, the folks who are absolutely positively certain that God exists.
Got it.
Yeah.
At one end of the spectrum.
And then on the other end, you've got the strong atheists. They're just as certain that God doesn't exist.
Makes sense. And then in between.
Well, that's where things get interesting. You've got all these shades of belief and skepticism, people who lean one way or the other, folks who are unsure, those who don't really think about it much.
It's kind of a gradient of belief.
Yeah.
That's really helpful for visualizing it.
Exactly.
I bet a lot of people listening are thinking, okay, where do I fall on that spectrum right now?
I'd say so.
But, it leads to another tricky question, right? How do you even begin to prove or disprove something like God's existence? Where do you even start?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, right?
Definitely interesting.
Because before we jump into the arguments themselves, we need to think about some of the assumptions that are baked into this whole discussion. Assumptions about knowledge, about reality, about belief itself.
It's not just a question of faith. It's a question of how we know anything at all.
Exactly.
Is it even possible to scientifically prove or disprove something that might be beyond the realm of science?
Right.
I mean, how do you design an experiment to test for something supernatural?
And even defining what supernatural means, it's a rabbit hole for sure.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a rabbit hole.
Now, some philosophers, particularly this group called the logical positivists, they took a pretty strong stance on this.
Okay, tell me about them. Logical positivists.
They were big on the idea of verifiability. If a statement couldn't be empirically tested, they considered it meaningless.
So basically they were saying, show me the lab results or it's not real.
Pretty much, yeah. And some of the big names in this movement were Rudolf Carnap and A.J. Ayer.
So they would have said, if you can't design an experiment to test for God, then the whole question of God's existence is kind of pointless.
Yeah, essentially, because in their view, you can't prove or disprove it.
That's a radical view. I mean, that's a really different way of thinking about it.
Oh, absolutely. And it contrasts sharply with, say, the Catholic Church's position.
Okay.
They hold that God's existence can be known, but it's through reason and through observing the natural world.
Right. So through, like, looking at creation.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, we're dealing with these totally different ideas about what counts as proof when it comes to God.
Yeah, and those different perspectives, they really inform all the arguments we're going to be looking at.
For and against.
Yeah, both for and against God's existence.
It's going to be a fascinating journey.
It is.
Okay. So we've set the stage. I feel like we're ready to, like, really dive into the arguments themselves. What do you think?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So let's start with arguments for the existence of God. What's the first category we're looking at?
Well, I think it makes sense to start with the logical arguments, the ones that rely on reason and kind of deduction.
So these are the arguments that say, okay, if we start with these basic assumptions, we can logically arrive at the conclusion that God exists.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Like almost like a mathematical proof.
Kind of, yeah. Now, some of the most famous arguments in this category come from this medieval philosopher and theologian, Thomas Aquinas.
Oh, yeah, Aquinas.
His arguments are known as Aquinas' 5 ways.
5 ways to prove God's existence.
That's right.
Now, I've heard of those, but honestly, they always seemed a bit complicated to me.
Oh, they definitely can be.
So can you give us like a simplified version?
Sure. Like one of his arguments, the first cause argument, it basically says that every effect has to have a cause.
Okay, makes sense.
So if you keep tracing those causes back and back and back, you eventually have to get to a first cause.
Like a starting point for everything.
Right. And Aquinas said, well, that first cause, that's God.
Okay, I can kind of follow that logic. What are some of the other ways?
Well, there's the argument from motion, which is kind of similar. It says everything in motion had to be set in motion by something else. And eventually you get to an unmoved mover who started it all.
So like the ultimate domino that tipped over all the other dominoes.
Exactly. And again, Aquinas identifies this unmoved mover with God.
These arguments are definitely thought-provoking, but I can already hear some people out there saying, okay, but even if everything needs a cause, who caused God?
Oh, yeah, you're hitting on a common criticism.
It's like it kind of pushes the question back a step.
It does. It's like an infinite regression. But, you know, these arguments, they've been debated for centuries.
And they're still relevant today.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing to me how people have been grappling with this question for so long.
Right.
Now, is there like a more modern version of this kind of argument?
There is. And it's actually pretty similar to Aquinas' arguments. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument.
Kalam. Okay.
And it's really popular with philosophers like William Lane Craig.
What makes the Kalam argument different?
Well, it really zeroes in on the idea that the universe had a beginning.
Okay.
The basic premise is this. Whatever begins to exist, it has to have a cause.
Okay.
The universe began to exist. Therefore.
The universe had a cause.
Exactly.
And that cause being...
Well, God, according to the Kalam argument.
Of course.
But, of course, critics point out that this just raises the same question, like, what caused God?
Right, back to that infinite regress problem.
It's hard to escape, right? It's like a fundamental mystery.
It really is. So we've talked about arguments that focus on cause and effect. Are there any other types of logical arguments for God's existence?
Oh, definitely. And one of the most, I guess you could say notorious ones is the ontological argument.
The ontological argument. Okay, that's one that I've always found particularly mind-boggling.
It is. It's a real head-scratcher.
So remind me, like, what's the basic gist of the ontological argument?
Well, it was famously formulated by St. Anselm in the 11th century.
Okay.
And his argument really centers on the concept of God.
So not so much about, like, looking at the world around us for evidence, but more about just thinking about the idea of God.
Right. So Anselm said God, by definition, is the greatest being imaginable.
Okay.
And he argued that existing is greater than not existing.
Because if something exists, it's, like, more real, I guess.
Exactly. So Anselm's conclusion was that the greatest being imaginable, therefore, must exist.
Because if it didn't exist, it wouldn't be the greatest.
Precisely. It's like saying, if you can imagine the perfect pizza.
It has to exist somewhere, at least in the realm of possibility.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay, that analogy helps.
Yeah.
But even with the pizza analogy, it still feels a bit like, you know.
A leap.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And Anselm's argument has been criticized by a lot of philosophers over the centuries. Like Immanuel Kant, he said, Existence isn't a quality you can just, like, add to a concept.
It's like, just because I can think of a unicorn doesn't mean it suddenly pops into existence.
Right. Too bad for us, huh?
Yeah, I guess so. But it's amazing that these arguments are still being discussed today.
It is. It shows just how enduring these questions are.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about these logical arguments, which are fascinating, but, pretty abstract. Are there arguments for God's existence that are based more on our observations and experiences in the world?
Oh, absolutely. And those are called empirical arguments.
Empirical, meaning based on evidence.
Exactly. So instead of just thinking about the concept of God, these arguments look for clues in the world around us.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What are some examples of empirical arguments for God?
Well, some point to the incredible complexity and beauty of nature, like the intricate design of a flower or the vastness of the universe.
It's like that feeling of awe you get when you see a sunset or, I don't know, a galaxy through a telescope.
Exactly. And some people experience that and think, there's no way something this amazing could have just happened by chance.
Like it points to some kind of intelligent design.
That's the argument. And then there's the argument from consciousness.
Okay, consciousness. How does that relate to God's existence?
Well, the argument basically says that the very fact that we have these subjective experiences, that we can think and feel and be aware of ourselves, this suggests there's something more than just matter.
Like, consciousness couldn't have arisen from just, like, random physical processes.
That's the idea.
Interesting.
Another empirical argument focuses on what's called the fine-tuning of the universe. Like the fact that the laws of physics and the constants of nature seem so precisely calibrated to allow for life.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that.
Your argument is that this fine-tuning is so improbable, it points to a cosmic designer who set things up just right.
So it's kind of a cosmic version of the watchmaker analogy.
You got it.
Makes you feel pretty small, huh?
It does. And then, of course, there's the argument from religious experience.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah. For people who have had powerful religious experiences, feelings of connection with the divine, or even what they perceive as direct encounters with God.
Those experiences can be incredibly compelling.
Right. And while personal experiences are subjective, they can be very powerful for those who have them.
It's hard to just dismiss them as, like, hallucinations or something.
Exactly. And one philosopher, William J. Abraham, he made this interesting point. He said, we don't dismiss every report of seeing a chair just because sometimes people hallucinate and think they see one.
That's a good analogy. So are you saying we should give the same weight to religious experiences?
It's a good question, right? Like, how much weight should we give these personal experiences, especially when we're dealing with these huge questions about existence?
It's something to ponder, for sure.
It is.
So, wow, we've covered a lot of ground already, from Aquinas to Anselm, from the fine-tuning of the universe to personal experiences of the divine. It seems like people have come up with a lot of different ways to try to reason their way to God, or at least to find some evidence for God's existence.
Right.
It's amazing how these ideas have persisted for centuries.
It is.
But I imagine there's another side to this conversation, right?
Oh, absolutely. Just as there are arguments for God's existence, there are also arguments against it.
Okay, so let's dive into those next.
Yeah.
So we've explored some pretty compelling arguments for God's existence, but like with any big question, there's always another side to consider. What about the arguments against the idea of God?
Right. It's important to look at both sides.
Yeah, definitely. So where do we even begin with the arguments against God's existence?
Well, just like we started with those logical arguments for God's existence, there are also logical arguments against it.
Okay, so are we talking about arguments that, like, directly challenge Aquinas' 5 ways, or that Kalam cosmological argument?
Some do, yeah. Like one common counterpoint is this idea that there's just no scientific evidence for God. If we can't detect God through, our scientific methods, then some people argue, well, it's reasonable to think that he just doesn't exist.
It's like that saying, if you can't measure it, is it really there? But then again, I've also heard people say that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence.
Right, exactly. It's a subtle point, right? Not finding proof isn't the same as proving something doesn't exist. But still, this lack of, empirical support, it's a big one for many atheists.
I can see that. So how about that Boeing 747 analogy that Dawkins uses? That one always stuck with me.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Does that one directly counter a specific argument for God's existence?
It does. It's a response to the argument from design. You know, the one that says the universe is so complex and seemingly purposeful that it must have had a designer.
Right, like, wow, look at this amazing universe. There's got to be a God behind it all.
Exactly. So Dawkins uses this analogy of a Boeing 747,
Right.
right? Theists might say, well, the universe is so complex, it's like a 747 just spontaneously forming out of a junkyard.
Which seems pretty impossible.
Right. And they see that as evidence of intelligent design. But Dawkins counters that, well, a 747, complex as it is, it's still a product of human engineering.
Like, we understand the process of how it's made.
Right. And he says, even if the universe was designed, it just pushes the question back a step, right?
Because then you have to ask, well, who designed the designer?
Exactly. It creates this infinite regress problem.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls. You keep opening them up, and there's always another one inside.
Exactly. It's tough to get around.
So are there any other logical arguments against God that also tackle this idea of a designer?
Yeah, some arguments focus specifically on like the traditional attributes of God, omnipotent, omniscience.
Okay, so like God being all-powerful and all-knowing.
Exactly. And they point out potential contradictions within these concepts.
Oh, right, like those classic paradoxes that have been stumping philosophers for centuries, like the whole, can God create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it thing.
Exactly. That's the omnipotence paradox.
It's a classic. If he can create it, he's not all-powerful because he can't lift it. But if he can't create it, then he's also not all-powerful because there's something he can't do.
Right. It's a mind bender.
Are there other paradoxes like that, but maybe related to God's all-knowingness?
There are. Like, so some argue if God already knows the future, then he can't really be free to act, right?
Oh, I see.
Because everything's already predetermined.
It's like, if you already know how a movie ends, can you really say you're choosing to watch it?
Right. It challenges our understanding of what free will even means.
Definitely makes you think. Now, I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, so to speak, when it comes to arguments against God's existence. What about the problem of evil?
Ah, yes. The big one.
It's a tough one, for sure. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, how can there be so much suffering in the world?
It's a question that has haunted humanity for, well, probably as long as we've been around. You know, if God is truly good, why do bad things happen to good people?
Why is there so much pain, so much injustice?
Right. It's the question that often comes up when people experience personal tragedies or witness horrific events in the news.
Now, I know there are, like, different versions of this problem of evil, right? Something about a logical problem versus an evidential problem.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. The logical problem of evil, it argues that the very existence of evil is just logically incompatible with the existence of a God who's all those things. All-powerful, all-knowing, all-good.
So it's like saying, if a perfect being existed, evil wouldn't. Evil clearly exists, therefore, such a God can't.
That's the basic idea, but then there's the evidential problem of evil, which is a little different.
Okay, how so?
Well, it acknowledges that, okay, maybe God could have reasons for allowing evil that we just can't comprehend.
Like our limited human minds just can't grasp the big picture.
Right. But the evidential problem of evil, it says, look, the sheer amount of suffering, the intensity of it, it just makes it really unlikely that a benevolent God exists.
So even if it's logically possible, the evidence we see in the world just doesn't seem to support it.
Exactly. Now, in response to this problem of evil, theologians have come up with different theodicies.
Theodicies. Remind me what those are again.
They're attempts to kind of reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of a good God. One of the most common ones centers around free will.
Free will.
The argument is that, God gave humans free will, and evil is a consequence of our choices, not of God's actions.
So it's not God's fault that we do bad things to each other. It's on us.
That's the idea. Other theodicies suggest that maybe suffering serves some greater purpose that we can't see.
The classic everything happens for a reason argument.
Yeah. Like maybe it's a test of faith or a catalyst for spiritual growth, something like that.
Interesting. But I imagine even with these theodicies, the problem of evil is still like a really tough one to fully resolve.
It is. It's deeply complex, and it's emotionally charged, especially for those who have personally experienced great suffering.
For sure. Now, earlier we talked about those empirical arguments for God's existence, the ones based on, observations of the world around us. Are there any empirical arguments against God as well?
There are. One is the argument from inconsistent revelations.
Okay, inconsistent revelations. What does that mean?
Well, it basically points to all the conflicting scriptures and doctrines that you find across different religions.
Oh, right. Like if there's one true God, why are there so many different versions of what that God wants or expects from us?
Exactly. It's a point that a lot of people who question the validity of, organized religion bring up.
Makes sense.
Another empirical argument against God is based on this principle called parsimony. You might have heard of Occam's razor.
Oh, yeah. From philosophy class. The simplest explanation is usually the best, right?
Exactly. So the argument from parsimony says that, look, natural explanations, like the ones we get from science, they're enough to explain the universe. We don't need to add God into the equation.
It's like if we can explain how things work without God, why bother?
That's the basic idea.
Keep it simple. I like it.
And then there's the argument from non-belief.
Non-belief, okay.
This one kind of focuses on the question of, well, if God is all good and all powerful and wants us to believe in him, why don't more people?
That's an interesting point.
Hmm.
Like, if God wants a relationship with us, you'd think he'd make it a little easier to find him.
Right. It suggests that maybe he hasn't done the best job of making his existence clear, especially to those who are genuinely seeking.
Hmm. Lots to think about.
It is.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground tonight, haven't we? I mean, from Aquinas's 5 ways to that Boeing 747 analogy, from the problem of evil to all these different theodicies. It's clear that this question of God's existence has really captivated and challenged human minds for a long, long time.
It has.
And I think what's really striking is how these arguments, both for and against, they're not just like abstract philosophical ideas. They really touch on some of the deepest questions we have about ourselves, about the meaning of life, about suffering, about our place in the universe.
They do. And ultimately, this question of whether God exists, it's one that each of us has to grapple with on our own terms, weighing the evidence, the experiences, and even just our own intuitions.
Absolutely. And even if we don't come to like definitive answers,
Yeah.
I think the very act of exploring these questions, it can be incredibly enriching.
It can.
It makes us think critically. It makes us consider different perspectives.
Yeah.
And it just reminds us of the vast mystery of it all.
It does. And on that note, maybe a final thought to leave our listeners with tonight. If the universe was designed, what kind of clues might we look for that would be different from what we can observe through science right now?
Ooh, that's a good one to ponder. Especially on Christmas Eve, it reminds us that this search for truth, whether it's about God or anything else, it's an ongoing journey.
It is. And on that note, for me, I wish you a very peaceful and reflective holiday season.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the enduring question of God's existence. As always, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep exploring the wonders of the universe. Until next time.